Detroit, December 1974. The conference room at Motown Records sits heavy with tension. Barry Gordy leans back in his leather chair, his fingers drumming against the mahogany table. Across from him, Marvin Gaye stares out the window at the gray Michigan sky, his jaw clenched, his hands folded in his lap. "You're being difficult, Marvin." Barry's voice cuts through the silence. "The label needs product. The fans want more music. What's going on was 3 years ago." Marvin turns slowly, his eyes meeting Barry's for the first time in 20 minutes. "What's going on changed everything. You know that. I can't just go back to singing love songs like nothing happened." Barry stands up, walks around the desk. His voice drops lower, more controlled. "You're not an artist, Marvin. You're a product, my product, and products don't get to choose what they are." The words hang in the air like smoke from a cigarette that's been left too long. Marvin feels something inside him break, not dramatically, not violently, just quietly, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. He stands up without saying another word and walks out of the room. Barry calls after him, but Marvin doesn't turn around. He walks down the hallway past the gold records on the walls, past the photographs of himself smiling and performing, past the secretary who pretends not to notice the tension crackling in his wake. That afternoon, Marvin sits in his car in the Motown parking lot for 2 hours. He doesn't start the engine. He doesn't turn on the radio. He just sits there, watching employees walk in and out of the building, wondering when exactly he stopped being a person and became a commodity. What Marvin doesn't know yet is that this moment will define the next 2 years of his life. 2 years of creative paralysis, of refusing to record, of watching other artists take his place on the charts while he wages a silent war against the machine that made him famous. The conflict between Marvin and Motown wasn't born in that conference room in December 1974. It had been building for years like pressure in a fault line, waiting for the right moment to split everything apart. When Marvin first signed with Motown in 1961, he was grateful for the opportunity, eager to please, willing to sing whatever songs Barry Gordy put in front of him. But success changed him. More specifically, the success of What's Going On changed him. For the first time in his career, Marvin had created something that was entirely his own, something that spoke to his soul rather than to market research. The album had been a commercial and critical triumph, proving that soul music could address serious social issues, that audiences were hungry for depth and authenticity. But to Barry Gordy, What's Going On represented a dangerous precedent. If Marvin could choose his own material, his own message, then other artists might start demanding the same freedom. So when Marvin came to Barry with ideas for a follow-up album, something equally personal and politically conscious, Barry shut him down. "Stick to what works," he said. "Give them more romance, more dancing. Leave the politics to the politicians." Marvin tried to explain that he couldn't compartmentalize his art like that his music had to come from something real inside him. But Barry wasn't interested in artistic integrity. He was interested in profit margins and radio airplay and keeping the Motown machine running smoothly. The first year of the standoff, 1975, Marvin tried to compromise. He showed up to scheduled recording sessions, sat in the studio with producers and session musicians, attempted to summon enthusiasm for songs that felt hollow to him. But every take sounded lifeless. Every vocal performance felt like an imitation of himself. Studio engineers who worked with Marvin during this period later described sessions where he would sing a song perfectly from a technical standpoint, but with no emotion, no passion, no connection to the material. It was as if he was sleepwalking through his own career. After particularly frustrating sessions, Marvin would sit alone in the vocal booth with his headphones on, staring at the microphone as if it were a foreign object. Sometimes he would hum melodies to himself, fragments of songs that lived in his head, but never made it onto tape because they didn't fit the Motown formula. Producer Willie Hutch, who worked with Marvin several times during this period, later recalled one session where Marvin stopped mid-song and said, "I feel like I'm singing someone else's life. These words don't belong to me anymore." The label executives grew impatient. Motown was a business, and businesses need product to sell. Without new Marvin Gaye material, they were losing money and momentum. Barry Gordy began scheduling meetings with Marvin that felt more like interventions than creative discussions. Look at Diana, Barry would say, pointing to the success of Diana Ross's solo career. Look at Stevie. They trust the system. They give us what we need, and we make them stars. But Marvin wasn't Diana or Stevie. His relationship with his art was more complicated, more personal. He needed to believe in what he was singing, needed to feel that his voice was serving something larger than commerce. By early 1976, the tensions had escalated to the point where Marvin was barely showing up to Motown at all. He would miss scheduled recording sessions without explanation, ignore phone calls from producers, and when he did appear at the studio, he seemed distracted and disconnected. It was during this period that Marvin began experimenting with what he privately called guerrilla recording. Late at night, after Motown's offices had closed, he would slip into smaller, independent studios around Detroit and Los Angeles, paying out of his own pocket to record songs that he couldn't or wouldn't record under the Motown label. These unauthorized sessions became Marvin's lifeline during the creative drought. Working with musicians who didn't know him as Marvin Gaye, the Motown star, he could explore musical ideas that felt authentic to him, songs that dealt with spirituality, social justice, and personal pain in ways that the Motown formula wouldn't allow. The ritual was always the same. Marvin would arrive at these studios after midnight, when the parking lots were empty and the hallways echoed with silence. He would pay the engineer in cash, always cash, leaving no paper trail that might lead back to Motown's legal department. Then he would sit alone in the control room for 20 or 30 minutes, just listening to the silence, trying to shed the weight of expectation that followed him everywhere else. One night at a small studio in Hollywood, Marvin recorded a version of Inner City Blues that was rawer, angrier than anything he'd ever put on tape. In this version, his voice cracked with genuine rage, and between verses, he spoke directly to the microphone about walking through Detroit neighborhoods where hope had died, about young men he'd grown up with who'd been destroyed by poverty and violence. The engineer who captured that session, a young man named Tommy who'd never heard of Marvin Gaye before that night, later said he'd never experienced anything like it. He wasn't performing, Tommy remembered. He was confessing. I felt like I was eavesdropping on someone's prayers. Another session, recorded in a basement studio in Detroit's Corktown neighborhood, featured Marvin experimenting with jazz fusion, layering his vocals over complex instrumental arrangements that bore no resemblance to anything in the Motown catalog. He would spend hours working on a single vocal phrase, not because it was technically difficult, but because he was searching for an emotional truth that kept slipping away from him in his official recordings. During one particularly intense session in late 1975, Marvin began working on a song he called Freedom Song, a meditation on artistic autonomy that would never see commercial release. The lyrics were simple, almost childlike. I want to sing my own song. I want to find my own way. I want to be myself again. Why can't I be myself today? But the way Marvin delivered them, with a vulnerability that bordered on desperation, transformed the simple words into something devastating. One engineer who worked with Marvin during these clandestine sessions described him as a different person in the studio. At Motown, he seemed trapped, like he was wearing a costume that didn't fit. But at 2 a.m. in some tiny studio in Hollywood, he came alive again. He was creating for himself, not for anyone else. But these sessions also revealed the depth of Marvin's isolation. Between takes, he would sometimes talk to the engineers about feeling like he was living someone else's life, about waking up in the morning and not recognizing the person in the mirror. He spoke about the loneliness of being famous for something that no longer felt connected to who he really was. Success is supposed to feel good, he told one engineer during a break, but all I feel is empty, like I'm successful at being someone I don't even like. The most haunting of these unauthorized recordings was a song Marvin simply called The Man in the Mirror. It was recorded entirely solo, just Marvin and a piano, in a studio so small that his breath was audible between phrases. The song was essentially a conversation with his reflection, questioning every choice he'd made since signing with Motown, wondering if the person looking back at him was someone worth saving. The recording lasted 13 minutes, but only the first 4 contained lyrics. The rest was just Marvin sitting at the piano, occasionally playing a few notes, sometimes humming, sometimes sitting in complete silence while the tape continued to roll. The songs Marvin recorded during these midnight sessions were never intended for commercial release. They were exercises in creative freedom, ways of keeping his artistic spirit alive while his official career remained in limbo. Some were instrumentals, explorations of jazz and funk that pushed beyond the boundaries of traditional soul music. Others featured lyrics that were too political, too personal, or too experimental for mainstream radio. But even these secret recording sessions couldn't completely satisfy Marvin's creative hunger. He was still trapped in a contract that gave Motown control over his official output, still required to show up for meetings and photo shoots and promotional events for an image that no longer felt like his own. The breaking point came in the summer of 1976, during a meeting that was supposed to be about planning Marvin's next album. Barry Gordy had assembled a team of writers and producers, and they presented Marvin with a collection of songs that they believed would restore his commercial momentum. Marvin listened politely to the demos, nodding at appropriate moments, but inside he felt a familiar numbness creeping in. The songs were competently written, professionally produced, and completely soulless. They could have been performed by any number of Motown artists, which was exactly the point. When the presentation ended, Barry looked at Marvin expectantly. "Well, what do you think?" Marvin was quiet for a long moment, staring at the tape recorder that had just played back 2 hours of music that meant nothing to him. "I think," he said finally, "that these songs will sell records. And I think that's all you care about." Barry's expression hardened. "That's not fair, Marvin. We've always supported your artistic vision." "My artistic vision?" Marvin laughed, but there was no humor in it. When? When have you ever supported something I wanted to do that didn't fit your business plan?" The room fell silent. The writers and producers exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't supposed to be a confrontation. It was supposed to be a collaborative planning session. Barry leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone he used when he wanted to remind people who was in charge. "Everything you are, everything you've achieved, you owe to this label. To me. Without Motown, you'd still be singing in church choirs for pocket change." Marvin felt the familiar knot of anger and helplessness tightening in his chest. Barry was right, of course. Motown had given him opportunities, fame, financial success. But success at what cost? What was the point of fame if it meant surrendering everything that made him unique as an artist? "Maybe," Marvin said quietly. "That would have been better. At least in church I was singing for something I believed in." He walked out of that meeting and didn't return to Motown for 6 months. During his absence, rumors began circulating throughout the music industry. Some people said Marvin was battling drug addiction. Others claimed he was having a nervous breakdown. The truth was both simpler and more complicated than the gossip suggested. Marvin was experiencing what would later be recognized as a form of creative depression, a condition that affects artists who feel disconnected from their authentic voice. He was physically healthy, mentally stable, but artistically suffocated. The weight of being reduced to a commercial product had crushed something essential in him, something that no amount of therapy or medication could restore. Only time and distance from the machine that had ground him down. He spent those months in a kind of self-imposed exile, living quietly in Los Angeles, avoiding the music business entirely. His daily routine became almost monastic in its simplicity. He would wake up late, around noon, and spend the first hour of consciousness just lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what it felt like to wake up excited about making music. Most afternoons, Marvin would drive aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles, no destination in mind, just moving through space while his thoughts moved through the wreckage of his career. He found himself drawn to neighborhoods where no one knew who he was, places where he could sit in a diner or walk through a park without being recognized, without having to perform the role of Marvin Gaye for strangers who thought they knew him. During one of these drives, Marvin pulled over at a small Baptist church in South Central Los Angeles where a gospel rehearsal was taking place. He sat in his car outside for 2 hours, listening to the voices drift through the open windows, remembering what it felt like when singing was worship rather than work. The simplicity of those voices, the pure intention behind them, made him realize how far he had drifted from the reasons he had started making music in the first place. He read books, watched movies, took long walks along the beach, tried to remember who he was before he became a product in Barry Gordy's catalog. But even these simple pleasures were haunted by the knowledge that somewhere in Detroit, executives were calculating the financial cost of his silence, that radio stations were playing his old songs while waiting for new ones that might never come. The nights were the hardest. Alone in his house with nothing to distract him from his thoughts, Marvin would find himself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Had he made a mistake walking away from Motown? Was artistic integrity worth destroying his career? Did he even have anything authentic left to express? Or had years of commercial compromise hollowed him out completely? Sometimes, late at night, he would sit at his piano and play for hours, not recording anything, just letting his fingers find melodies that felt true to him. These weren't sessions with any commercial purpose. They were conversations with himself, attempts to reconnect with the part of his soul that made music because it had to, not because it was expected to. During these midnight piano sessions, Marvin began to understand that the person he had been before Motown, the young man who sang in church because he believed in something larger than himself, was still there, buried under layers of commercial expectations and industry politics, but not dead. One night, after playing for almost 4 hours straight, Marvin called his brother Frankie and said something that surprised them both. "I think I remember why I started singing. It wasn't about fame or money or proving anything to anyone. It was about connection, to God, to other people, to the part of himself that music revealed better than words ever could." Friends who visited Marvin during this period described him as peaceful but hollow, like a house that's been beautifully maintained but has no one living in it. He seemed grateful for the break from the pressures of the music industry, but also lost without the structure and purpose that recording provided. The paradox was cruel. He needed to stop making music to remember why he had started making music, but the silence was slowly killing the part of him that music had always sustained. "I don't know who I am without the music," he confided to a close friend, "but I don't know who I am with it either, at least not the way they want me to make it." Meanwhile, Motown was struggling to explain Marvin's absence to the press and the public. They released statements about his need for creative rest, his desire to spend time with family, his plans for a spectacular comeback. But privately, label executives were growing increasingly worried about the financial impact of his refusal to record. Marvin Gaye was one of Motown's biggest stars, and his silence was costing them millions in potential revenue. Other labels began approaching him with offers, trying to lure him away from Motown with promises of creative freedom and higher royalty rates. But Marvin's contract with Motown was ironclad, designed to keep valuable artists tied to the label for years. Breaking free would require legal battles that could take years and cost more money than he had. So he remained trapped in a kind of artistic purgatory, too valuable for Motown to release, too creatively stifled to produce the music they wanted from him. The resolution, when it finally came, was not the dramatic breakthrough that both sides had hoped for. In early 1977, Marvin and Barry Gordy reached a compromise that satisfied neither of them completely but allowed both to save face. Marvin agreed to return to recording, but with greater creative input into his material. Barry agreed to give him more artistic freedom, but retained final approval over what would be released commercially. Their first collaboration under this new arrangement was the album Here My Dear, Marvin's bitter musical autobiography about his divorce from Anna Gordy, Barry's sister. It was a deeply personal, often angry record that violated every rule of the Motown handbook, but it was also unmistakably authentic in a way that Marvin's music hadn't been for years. The album was a commercial disappointment, too strange and personal for mainstream audiences, but it represented something more important than sales figures. It was proof that Marvin could still create music that mattered to him, even within the constraints of the system that had tried to silence his authentic voice. Looking back, the 2 years Marvin spent refusing to record weren't wasted time. They were necessary time, a period of artistic hibernation that allowed him to rediscover his creative identity on his own terms. But the cost was enormous. 2 years of prime creative time lost, relationships damaged, momentum squandered, and most importantly, a fundamental trust broken between an artist and the institution that had shaped his career. Marvin never fully recovered from the realization that his value to Motown was purely commercial, that his artistic vision was secondary to market considerations. It colored every subsequent interaction he had with the label, every recording session, every creative decision. The silence had served its purpose, but it had also revealed truths that couldn't be unlearned. Marvin had discovered the limits of his power within the system, and the system had discovered the limits of its power over him. Neither side won the standoff completely, but both sides were forever changed by it. And the music that emerged from that tension, difficult and uncompromising as it was, represented something rare in popular music. The sound of an artist refusing to be anything other than himself, regardless of the consequences. Years later, when asked about that period of his career, Marvin would say that those 2 years of silence taught him more about music than any amount of recording could have. Sometimes, he learned, the most important thing an artist can do is refuse to create anything at all until they remember why they started creating in the first place. The scars remained, though. In every subsequent negotiation with record labels, in every creative decision, in every moment when commercial considerations threatened to override artistic integrity, Marvin would remember that conference room in December 1974, and Barry Gordy's words, "You're not an artist, Marvin. You're a product." He spent the rest of his career proving that statement wrong, one song at a time.